Before we get into anything else today, I want you to picture two rooms. In one room, on July 13th, an American president is standing in front of cameras announcing that the United States is reposing a naval blockade on Iran and will now be, in his words, the guardian of the Strait of Hormuz. In the other room, at almost exactly the same hour, a Russian energy minister is sitting across a table from Iranian officials in Tehran, closing the final details of a gas agreement that has nothing to do with ships, nothing to do with the strait, and everything to do with making that blockade matter less than Washington thinks it does. Same day, two rooms, and almost nobody watching the news that night understood that they were watching one story, not two. That is what I want to fix today, because when you put these two rooms side by side, you don't just get a headline about an escalating war. You get a preview of how great powers actually decline in real time on camera while insisting the whole time that they are getting stronger. By the end of this video, you are going to understand why the blockade Trump announced on July 13th was already structurally compromised before the first ship was ever turned away. Not because Iran is winning some kind of military victory, because of geography, energy economics, and a pattern of behavior that political theorists have been describing for 2,400 years. Let's get into it. First, let's lay out exactly what happened because the sequence matters more than people realize. On July 13th, 2026, President Trump announced that the United States would reinstate a full naval blockade against Iranian ports, effective the following evening. He said the strait would remain open to everyone except Iran, and that the United States would now be known, in his words, as the guardian of the Hormuz Strait. In a Fox News interview that same day, he said something that I think is the most honest sentence any American president has said about this conflict in years. He said the U.S. had guarded the strait for 50 years and never got paid for it. That's not a policy justification. That's a grievance. Alongside the blockade, the administration proposed a 20% transit fee on cargo, passing through the strait framed as reimbursement for security. Within hours, that framing ran into a wall. Iran's foreign ministry pointed out that if safe passage is now something you pay for, then Iran can charge for it too. Gulf allies were reportedly never consulted on the toll structure at all. And critics immediately noted the irony that the same government, which has spent years insisting international waterways must remain free and open to all nations, was now the one attaching a price tag to passage through one. That's event number one. The blockade, the toll, the guardian language, and the immediate credibility problem it created. And notice how fast that credibility problem showed up. Not weeks later, not after some slow-building diplomatic backlash. Within hours, on the very day of the announcement, the contradiction was already the story, which tells you something about how thin the justification was to begin with. Event number two happened the same week, and almost nobody covered it with the seriousness it deserved. Russian and Iranian officials confirmed they had finalized the core terms of a long-term natural gas supply agreement. Not a rumor, not a memorandum of understanding that might fall apart. Actual agreed terms. Russia will supply Iran with natural gas starting at 2 billion cubic meters a year through a pipeline route that runs via Azerbaijan into northern Iran, with room to expand toward 55 billion cubic meters a year, a volume comparable to what an entire Nord Stream pipeline once carried into Europe. Iran's oil minister confirmed the key terms were locked in. Under the arrangement, Iran can resell surplus gas to other buyers, which analysts estimate could bring in something in the range of 10 to 12 billion over the life of a 30-year contract. Now sit with that for a second. While the United States was sealing Iran's southern door, Russia was quietly building out Iran's northern one. Same week, different ocean, different hemisphere of the map, same strategic logic, and the global press covered these as two unrelated regional stories. A military story in one column, an energy story in another. I think that framing is exactly wrong, and understanding why is the whole point of this video. Let's bring in the first framework, because I think it explains what actually driving decision-making in Washington right now better than anything is coming out of a White House press briefing. Thucydides, writing his history of the Peloponnesian War around 2,400 years ago, argued that the great powers of his era were driven by exactly three forces regardless of what they said publicly: fear, honor, and interest. I know some of you are tired of hearing about a dead Greek historian on a Geopolitics channel, but stay with me, because the reason I keep returning to him is that he wasn't writing about Athens or Sparta specifically. He was writing about the mechanics of power itself, and those mechanics do not update with the news cycle. Fear first. The blockade, the strikes, the pressure campaign against Iran's nuclear infrastructure, all of it is being sold as strength. But underneath the toughness, what you're actually looking at is fear of relative decline, not fear of Iran alone. Fear that if the United States doesn't assert dominance over the strait right now, it cedes strategic ground to Russia and China permanently. And here is the paradox that makes Thucydides so uncomfortably accurate. The more a great power fears losing its position, the more aggressively it overreaches to protect that position, and the more that overreach accelerates the exact decline it was trying to prevent. A blockade meant to demonstrate control instead produced international condemnation, a scramble by allies to distance themselves from it, and a new incentive for Iran to accelerate exactly the kind of alternative trade relationships the blockade was supposed to make impossible. Honor second, and I think this is the piece almost nobody is talking about correctly. The blockade didn't emerge out of a calm, calculated strategic review. It emerged after ceasefire talks collapsed, after a preliminary peace framework signed with real fanfare weeks earlier fell apart, after both sides accused each other of walking away from the table, when Trump went on television afterward and said the US had made 10 deals with Iran, and Iran always breaks them. That's not a strategic statement, that's wounded pride talking. And Thucydides is very specific about what happens when honor, not strategy, drives decision-making. You start making choices designed to protect your image rather than achieve your objective. You announce a toll structure so obviously extractive that the very country you're blockading can mock it, which is exactly what happened when Iranian officials sarcastically noted that if the US wants to charge for passage, perhaps Iran should too. When your adversary is using your own policy language against you as satire, that's not a messaging problem. That's honor overriding strategy in real time. Interest third. And here Trump has actually been unusually candid, more candid than most world leaders ever are about this motivation. He said outright that America has been protecting the strait for free for 50 years while everyone else profits, and that it's time to get paid. That's raw interest. No dressing it up in the language of values or rules-based order, and I'll give them this much. At least it's honest. Most leaders wrap interest in the language of principle and norms. This administration mostly skips that step. But here's what the theory of interest actually tells you, and it's a little counterintuitive. When a hegemon starts extracting direct payment for public goods, it used to provide for free in exchange for the indirect benefit of a stable system. It doesn't strengthen its position. It reveals that the system was never really free in the first place, and it invites every other participant in that system to ask what else they're allowed to charge for now that the rules have visibly changed. A stable order isn't just backed by ships and missiles, it's backed by the belief that the rules apply consistently to everyone all the time. The moment that belief cracks, the cost of maintaining the same level of control goes up sharply because now you need force where you used to get consent for free. And force is always the more expensive option. Every nation that relies on free transit through a global choke point just got a very expensive lesson in how conditional that freedom actually is. And lessons like that don't get forgotten quickly. Now let's introduce the concept that I think the mainstream coverage has almost entirely missed. And once you see it, you cannot unseen it. I'm going to call it the northern off-ramp. Here's the theory behind squeezing Iran through its southern ports. Seal Bandar Abbas, seal Blusher, seal the export terminals, and you cut off oil revenue. And without oil revenue, the theory goes, Iran's capacity to sustain the conflict erodes. That theory works in a world where Iran's economic survival depends entirely on maritime trade through the Gulf. That is not the world Iran is operating in anymore, and it hasn't been for a while. Look at a map of Iran. It doesn't only face the Persian Gulf in the south, it has an entire northern border running along the Caspian Sea and Azerbaijan water and territory, where the United States Navy has no meaningful presence at all. Here's how the northern off-ramp actually functions, step by step. Step 1. Russian gas flows into northern Iran through a pipeline corridor via Azerbaijan. This is not new infrastructure built from scratch. The route has existed and been under discussion for years, going back to a memorandum signed between Gazprom and Iran's national gas company. What changed this July is that the parties locked in commercial terms and moved from planning to activation. Step 2. That imported Russian gas covers domestic energy demand in Iran's northern provinces, the regions closest to the pipeline. Step 3. That frees up gas Iran would otherwise have burned domestically in the north. gas that can instead support the national grid during wartime strain or move through alternative trade channels that simply don't run past anything the US Navy can intercept. Step 4. The broader trade corridor linking India, Iran, and Russia. The kind of route logistics analysts have been calling the international north-south transport corridor for years becomes more commercially attractive every time a maritime choke point gets more expensive or more dangerous to use. While Washington was locking the front door, Moscow and Tyrant were finishing construction on a back door that faces north. And they did it in the same week, arguably the same day. Now the numbers, because I want you to actually hold these in your head. 2 billion cubic meters a year. That's the starting volume of the Russia-Iran gas deal, with room to expand toward 55 billion. Iran's total domestic gas consumption runs well over 200 billion cubic meters a year. So even the initial phase of this deal reshapes how much of Iran's own southern gas production becomes available for other uses. Whether that's grid stability, industrial use, or trade through channels the blockade cannot reach. 10 to 12 billion roughly is the annual revenue range analysts attached to Iran's resale rights on surplus gas over the life of a 30-year contract. That is not pocket change for an economy under sanctions pressure. And then there's Blusher, Iran's only operating nuclear power plant built and still partly staffed by Russia's state nuclear company, Rosatom. With roughly 480 Russian nationals reported on site, even after partial evacuations, this plant has already been struck or nearly struck multiple times over the course of the broader conflict. Close enough on at least one occasion that Iranian authorities reported a fatality from projectile fragments nearby. According to the International Atomic Energy Agency, Rosatom's Director General, Alexa Lakis, didn't mince words about what a direct hit on an operating reactor would mean, comparing the risk explicitly to Chernobyl. The head of the IAEA, Raphael G., has warned that strikes anywhere near an active nuclear facility risk, crossing what he called the reddest line in nuclear safety. Read that sentence again. The head of the United Nations nuclear watchdog is using apocalyptic language about a facility that Russian nationals are still working inside of in an active war zone. That is not a minor diplomatic footnote. That is a tripwire. And both Moscow and Thrawn know it functions as one whether or not Washington wants to treat it that way. All right. Now for the second framework, because this is the one that I think explains not just what happened this week, but the shape of the next decade. Hegemonic stability theory developed across the work of three major international relations thinkers: Charles Kindleberger, Robert Gilpin, and Robert Keoghan. They disagree on plenty, but they share one core premise. The international system, open trade routes, stable shipping lanes, functioning markets only work smoothly when there is one dominant power, both willing and able, to provide what they call global public goods, freedom of navigation chief among them, without demanding direct payment for it, because the payoff comes indirectly through a more stable and more profitable world overall. For 80 years, that role belonged to the United States and the Gulf. The Navy kept the strait open not out of generosity, but because an open strait made the entire global economy and America's position within it more valuable than a closed or monetized one ever could. On July 13th, that arrangement effectively ended. Kindleberger has a term for the moment a hegemon stops absorbing that cost willingly. He calls it hegemonic fatigue, the point where the dominant power can no longer or will no longer pay to maintain the system it built. Gilpin takes that idea further and adds a harder edge. He argues that when hegemonic fatigue sets in, the declining power doesn't quietly step back. It reaches for coercion because it can no longer secure compliance through legitimacy alone. He calls this the hegemonic thrashing phase. And the clearest signal you're in it is when the power that wrote the rules starts breaking them to hold its position. A government that spent years insisting international waterways must remain free for all nations, suddenly attaching a 20% toll to one. That's not hypocrisy in the ordinary sense. That's thrashing. And Keoghan, the most optimistic of the three, the one who believed institutions could outlast any single hegemon, would tell you this is the most dangerous phase of all, because legitimacy lost through coercion doesn't come back. Every time you use force to enforce a rule, you yourself are actively breaking, you don't strengthen the rule. You hand every other country a justification to build their own workload. The instant condemnation from allies, the immediate mockery from Iran's own officials, Russia and Iran accelerating an entirely separate trade architecture in direct response. These aren't isolated news items. They're symptoms of exactly the deconcentrating Kindleberger, Gilpin, and Kagan all predicted. Power and legitimacy dispersing outward toward a multipolar system live in front of us. Now, before I give you my conclusion, I want to steelman the other side properly because you deserve the strongest version of the counter-argument, not a straw man. Here's the best case for the blockade strategy working. The northern off-ramp, as I've described it, is still mostly potential rather than fully realized capacity. The current pipeline infrastructure through Azerbaijan can only move a fraction of the 55 billion cubic meter ceiling right now. The expansion will take real time, real investment, and real engineering. In that window, months, maybe longer, a sustained blockade combined with continued economic and military pressure could still squeeze Iran's export revenue hard enough to force real concessions. Economic pressure has worked against smaller, more isolated states before, and the U.S. military remains by a wide margin the most capable maritime force in the world. That argument is not baseless. But here's where I think it breaks down for two specific reasons. First, the existing pipeline route doesn't need to be built from nothing. It needs to be scaled. And scaling existing infrastructure is a fundamentally faster problem than building new infrastructure. The corridor through Azerbaijan already exists. The memorandum between Gazprom and Iran's gas company was signed years ago. What changed this July was commercial activation, not construction from a blank map. Once gas is actually flowing and money is actually changing hands, expanding capacity becomes an engineering and financing question, not a diplomatic one. And those move on a timeline measured in months, not years. Second, Blusher is a hard ceiling on how far military escalation can realistically go. You cannot pursue a maximum pressure campaign to its logical endpoint, direct strikes on Iran's energy and nuclear infrastructure, without eventually threatening a facility that Rosa Tam's own director has compared to Chernobyl and that the IAEA's director general has called a red line that threatens Russian nationals directly. It threatens the entire Gulf, including the very allies the blockade claims to be protecting, and it risks an escalation pathway with consequences no strategist actually wants to walk through out loud. The blockade has a ceiling. The northern off-ramp lowers the floor underneath it. Put those two constraints together and the strategic logic of pressure through blockade alone starts to look a lot shakier than the announcement made it sound. So, here's what I want you watching over the next several weeks. First, watch whether Russia's diplomatic language toward Iran shifts from purely economic partnership toward anything resembling explicit security backing. Energy cooperation is one category of relationship. It's transactional, it's reversible. Both sides can walk away from it without a crisis. Defense cooperation is an entirely different, much more consequential category, harder to reverse and far more provocative to Washington. And the line between them is worth tracking closely in every joint statement that comes out of Moscow or Tehran from here forward. Second, watch how India positions itself. India sits in an extraordinarily uncomfortable spot here. A strategic partner of Washington on one hand, a major beneficiary of any north-south corridor running through Iran on the other, and on top of both of those, a large buyer of discounted Russian energy that Washington has repeatedly pressured New Delhi to scale back. How India calibrates its public statements over the coming weeks, whether it leans toward Washington's framing, stays deliberately vague, or quietly deepens its own corridor investments, will tell you a lot about which direction the wider, non-aligned world is leaning as this drags on. Third, watch oil prices plainly, because this is the most honest indicator in the entire story. Every week that crude stays elevated is a week that non-Gulf oil producers profit while American consumers absorb the cost at the pump. Right in the run-up to a midterm election cycle where that kind of pocketbook pain shows up fast in approval numbers and even faster in campaign ads. That number, more than any press conference or diplomatic statement, will tell you in real time who's actually winning this standoff and who's just insisting they are. Your homework this week, 3 things. First, go find a map of the international north-south transport corridor and trace it with your own eyes. Look at where it runs, what ports and rail lines it touches, and compare that to what a naval blockade in the Persian Gulf can and cannot physically reach. The geography alone will make the entire argument for you far better than I can in words. Second, go read Trump's actual July statements about the blockade and the toll side by side with years of American rhetoric about freedom of navigation as a universal principle. Ask yourself honestly whether what you're looking at is a one-off contradiction or a signal of something structural. I'd argue it's the second one. Third, go read about what happened to Athens after the Sicilian expedition in Humidity's history. A dominant power at the height of its confidence, launching an overwhelming campaign against a smaller adversary, overextending its resources and triggering a slow cascade of strategic failures that eventually ended its dominance. Not because the smaller side was stronger, but because fear, honor, and short-term interest replaced strategic patience, written 2,400 years ago as a warning. Still, in my view, the single most useful thing you could read to understand the Gulf in 2026. One last thought before I let you go. Kindleberger argued that the world didn't slide into the Great Depression because any one country was malicious. It slid there because the old dominant power, Britain, could no longer afford to sustain global economic stability. And the rising power, the United States, wasn't yet willing to. In the gap between an old order fading and a new one not yet formed, the whole system fell through the cracks. We may be watching an early version of that same gap open up again, not over currency and trade this time, but over the free movement of ships through the world's most important energy choke point. The United States is signaling loudly and repeatedly that it no longer intends to provide freedom of navigation as a free public good. The alternative architecture, Russia, China, the corridor running north through Iran, isn't fully built yet either. And in that gap between the old guarantee and whatever replaces it, you get exactly what we're watching unfold right now. Diverted shipping, fractured supply chains, commodity prices swinging on a headline, smaller nations caught in the middle with no safe harbor to sit in. This isn't really a story about one impulsive announcement or one defiant government. It's a story about a structural transition in the international order that's been building for 2 decades and is now visibly speeding up. So, here's the question I want you sitting with before next week. When the power that wrote the rules starts breaking them in public, what happens to the rules? And what happens next to the power that broke them? Thucydides answered that question. So did Kindleberger and Gilpin and Keogham. They didn't all answer it the same way, but every one of them agreed on this much. The answer has never once been good for the side that broke the rules first. I'll see you next.